Well, hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Gather podcast. I'm Autumn Casiglia, and I am the Adult Ministry Director here at Faith and a psychotherapist, counselor, part-time. I'm also mom to Joe and Nathan and wife to Pastor Joe. And I am so happy you're here with us. If you're part of our Faith family, welcome. If you're not, welcome. We hope you enjoy. Today I get to interview Rebecca McLaughlin. She is a doctor trained at Cambridge University, PhD in literature, and also a theology degree from Oak Hill, right? College. And she wrote the book, Confronting Christianity, 12 Hard Questions for the World's Largest Religion. And I've enjoyed reading it. Our staff has enjoyed reading it. And so today we get to ask her some questions and get her to talk a little bit to us about where her heart was when she first decided to write this book. So, hi, Rebecca, welcome.
Hi, great to be here, virtually.
So you used to live in Old Cambridge, and now you live in New Cambridge. So tell me a little bit about how that happened.
I would say I used to live in real Cambridge, and now I live in what should be called New Cambridge, because it's in New England, so it ought to be New Cambridge. I was studying for my PhD. And people often say that if you're going to meet your future spouse, you're likely to meet them in college. So I spent 7 years in college, and it was only at the very end of that that I met my now husband, Brian.
That's great.
So, side note, I'm a firm believer that for Christians, singleness is at least as good as marriage, and commended to us in the scriptures. So for those single in the audience, you're not missing out on anything if you're not missing out on Jesus. But yeah, Brian and I met right at the end of my PhD as I was transitioning to seminary, and he still had a couple of years of his PhD to wrap up. He's from Oklahoma. I went to Oklahoma State for his undergrad, and then got a study abroad scholarship to come to the UK. And I always say it's really hard to find a good evangelical man in England. And so God sent me a boy from Oklahoma. And after I finished my my seminary degree, he finished his PhD. We got married the year before we both finished up, and then moved to the US right after that.
And so how does it compare across the pond? How does life here compare to there? Maybe Christianity and also weather, all of it.
Right, so many things to say. I lived most of my life either in London or in Cambridge, UK. And Cambridge, Mass, or Boston is kind of like if London and Cambridge, UK had a baby together, because it's a proper international city, which Cambridge, UK isn't. People don't fly into Cambridge really from international places. I mean, they do actually a bit in Europe, but just it's not a big city. And at the same time, it's really a college town. So I feel at home here. It's as close both geographically and culturally to being in the UK as you can be whilst being in America.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And honestly, it was a wrench to leave the UK, partly because of all the family and friends I was leaving behind, and partly because I was leaving what felt like a relatively sort of gospel poor country for a relatively gospel rich country. It didn't seem to make any sense on one level, but actually, as is often the case, I think when you kind of look back over your shoulder, it's often hard to see what God's doing when you look ahead. But when you look back over your shoulder, it's amazing to see how he works his purposes out. In terms of how the UK and the US are different, I live obviously in one of the more kind of secular parts of the US compared to a place like Oklahoma, for example. And yet I would say that Christianity is sort of Bible-believing, serious Christianity is probably more widespread here than it is in my hometown. I think in both places, the makeup of Jesus's church is extremely diverse, and I think this is one of the things that we miss often in the kind of headline news or stories about Christianity's decline. Is that actually, whereas it is true that among white Westerners, both in Europe and in the US, that fewer people are acknowledging, identifying as Christians,
Right.
There's sort of less cultural Christianity, that actually people from all sorts of other parts of the world, whether immigrants sort of like myself or folks who've grown up in the UK and the US who are not white, are actually significantly more likely to identify as Christians and to be regular members of their church, regular Bible readers, regular people, praying to the Lord, seeking to reach their friends for Jesus. So I see some similarities and some differences, but I see the same Jesus and the same kind of messy fellowship of faith in both places.
So interesting story. Joe and I, my husband and I, went to the UK. We got to travel and see churches that are growing there. So we visited about 7 churches and really met some wonderful people. And then on the plane back, we met a couple that was from Africa that was coming home to the United States to do mission work. They were from Africa coming to the United States to do mission work. So
yeah, it makes a lot of sense, honestly.
Yeah, exactly. And I think in our Western culture, we just, here we go with my earbuds not working for me. There we go. We think just that Christianity is just a Western faith, and we see Christianity rising all over the world, and yet missing out.
And the odd thing there is that if we read our Bibles more carefully, we'd know that Christianity has been a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multicultural movement from day one. In fact, we see the first African Christians coming to Jesus in the book of Acts.
Exactly.
So I think people sometimes have this idea that Christianity really took hold in the West, and then at some point sort of Western missionaries went to Africa, which is true. There's some truth in that story. But actually, there are African Christians in the Bible itself. And Ethiopia became one of the first officially Christian states in the world before the gospel ever came near to America. So I think sometimes we sort of, if we read the Bible more carefully, we'd be less surprised by some of the things we see today.
Well, and don't you think the root of all these questions that our culture is asking about Christianity really comes from that bias, that Western ethnocentric bias? A lot of these questions come from
at least some of them, yes.
Place. Yeah. So let's jump into some of that, some of the questions that are posed from the book that I just loved. One was like, how can an educated person believe in a physically raised Jesus? And that question came up throughout, is just how can you believe in the miracles, and how can you believe and take the Bible literally?
Yeah. So many things to say there. Firstly, I think it's easy for those who aren't Christians or who maybe are questioning whether they want to kind of continue with Christianity. It's easy to imagine that there is a perfectly coherent sort of secular alternative that does all the work that Christianity does for us without having to believe in crazy things like people being raised from the dead, or a miracle working God, or somebody who created the entire universe. But the more I've looked into it, the more I've realized that there just isn't. The alternative that's presented to us today is in many ways, the secular alternative is actually something that's built on Christian foundations. So when our secular friends, which I guess as many do, believe in universal human rights and equality, when they believe that men and women are intrinsically equal, when they believe that racism is wrong, or that it's not a good thing to dominate and oppress the weak, but it is a good thing to care for the poor and the sick. None of these things are self-evident truths. Apologies to the Declaration of Independence, saying we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. It's actually not a self-evident truth at all. It's a specifically Christian belief. Mm-hmm. And so I think what people don't realize is that the alternative to Christianity is not a more coherent, more intellectually defensible, more just, more moral, secular way of looking at things. It's pretty much an abyss.
Yeah, I'm hearing that, and I've heard another interview with you were talking about the author of a book, Homo Sapiens, and just how compelling that was to hear, the idea that when you break it down, if you want to believe in all the human rights and say they're universal, you do have to realize that, as most cultures do, like Iran and Saudi Arabia, who wouldn't sign the universal human rights statement, is like you break it down and you realize they're all based on Judeo-Christian beliefs.
Yeah, and I actually have this book here. People who are interested to see it. Sapiens: A Brief History of Humankind by Israeli historian Yuval Noah Harari, who identifies as an atheist himself. He's very clear about the fact that the idea of universal human equality came to us from Christianity, and that without it, I mean, he says that the scientific study of Homo sapiens has embarrassingly little to do with the idea of universal human equality. He says that human beings have no natural rights, just as hyenas, chimpanzees, and spiders have no natural rights. If we're brutally honest, if we're actually kind of truly honest about what the world looks like without God, then folks like him are being truly honest about it. But I don't think that message is actually like really penetrated or percolated at a social level, because we continue to have even folks who may not identify as Christians or Jews or identify with a particular kind of religious set of beliefs. Nonetheless, they'll have these kind of carryover beliefs, like the basic moral building blocks that we all sort of rely on. And even at times, honestly, like the idea that there is some kind of purpose to the universe, or that their loved ones who've died are looking down at them from a better place. I mean, I have friends who don't believe in God at all, who will say things like that. And I sort of wanted to gently say to them, if there is no God, there is no universe to have a purpose. There's actually, I mean, people talk about Christians being on the wrong side of history. From an atheist perspective, there's no story, there's no reason to think that the universe or the world or history is developing toward a more just place. And in fact, from an atheist perspective, there's no way of even knowing what that would be, because there's no real moral fabric to the universe. There's no sense in which you and I are anything more than a collection of atoms and molecules. And I always want to be clear, because sometimes I think as Christians we mishear that, and we say, okay, atheists often use the language of science to make these points, and so what we need to do is reject the science, and we need to say, no, you and I are not atoms and molecules. You and I are not mammals. You and I are not, all the things that science says that we are. Or that we need to find some piece of us that isn't, either in our kind of historical development or in our physical manifestation now. But actually, I don't think that's what we need to do at all. I think we need to say that we are not just those things.
Yeah, you give the story of putting your kids to bed, and I love that story. Yeah. How are you going to put your kids to bed?
I don't know how many folks listening are parents, but I have 3 kids who are 10, 8, and 2. And when I put them to bed, I could say, I am your progenitor. You and I are both mammals. Your other progenitor is in the other room, putting the baby down. I could tell them about their DNA and their sort of scientific origins. And all of those things could be true. But in fact, I tell them that I'm their mother and I love them. And I think even as we read the scriptures, sometimes we actually think too much about science, if that makes it. We sort of we actually get our priorities the wrong way around, and we sometimes miss the things that God is saying to us, because we're sort of bought into this idea that science is not just really important, but actually the most important thing. And I think is the more I've thought about it, the more I've realized that scientific explanations of things can be really helpful and useful and good and God-given. One of the early scientists talked about it being like sort of thinking God's thoughts after him.
Yeah.
They're actually not the most important thing that we have to say about ourselves.
Yeah. So when you say to your kids, I love you, I'm your mom, good night, that's connection, that's attachment, and that's what God's saying to us through his word, is he's trying to have an attachment with us. He's trying to have a relationship. And what I love about your book is you actually wrote it with a friend in mind, Natasha. And I think a lot of people are listening and they're thinking of friends at work that they love. They're thinking of their kids, their grandkids. And they know they're educated, but maybe they don't feel quite as educated as you, Rebecca, and they read your book and it's great, but it's a bit of a stretch for them. How can they make use of this book, this information, in a way that they can approach it not in a way of debating, but in a way of engaging and love? And what kind of stance should they take so that it's a life-giving conversation?
Yeah, that's super helpful. I think one of the most helpful things we can say as Christians in conversation with friends who may not be following Jesus is I don't know. I think to be willing to acknowledge the spaces and the questions and the times when we think, gosh, I actually don't know the answer to that, or maybe I have sort of some idea of the answer, but I'd really need to read up more, or maybe we can read up together, or maybe we need to look at what some experts, both Christian and non-Christian, have to say about these questions. What I've tried to do with this book and with the other books that I've got coming out as well is to give people access to experts' views on various things. Because the reality is none of us is an expert on more than one thing. We'll all have different areas of expertise, and your area of expertise, it could be astrophysics, or it could be homeschooling your kids, or it could be being an excellent worker in the environment that God's put you in, or all sorts of different kinds of expertise we might have. And none of us is going to really truly be an expert in more than one or maximum sort of two domains. And so we kind of need to listen to people who've done a lot more thinking than we have. And I absolutely class myself as somebody who needs to listen to folks who've done a lot more thinking than they have. I see myself less as an expert and more as sort of somebody who knows where the experts are to be found and can point other folks to them.
That's why I love it.
Christian friends to say, hey, I'm not saying I have all the answers, but I take your questions very seriously. I actually think one of the ways I tried to write Confronting Christianity and the kind of kids version of it was to say, these are really good and important questions. They're not ones that can be dismissed lightly. And often they're grounded in things that Christians should believe. For example, the question like, doesn't Christianity crush diversity? We should share with our non-Christian friends a belief in the goodness of love across racial, ethnic, socioeconomic difference. But actually, I think with each of these questions, when you look more closely at them, they become not a reason to not believe in Jesus, but a reason to believe in him.
Yeah, you get to know him personally as a person, and not the image of what you think is being portrayed through culture. And you see that he flipped the culture on its head. He changed the value of women and children drastically. I love the quotes in your book that talk about how it's the most diverse religion and the most, considerate towards women and children. And so when you look at that, I think that's important to look into. What I love, the way I look at the book too, is if my kids raise a question, I look at it as almost like an encyclopedia. Let me go back to this and reread this and kind of not to get facts to debate, but to say, hey, maybe you want to consider this in addition to these other things you're considering, because typically it's YouTube, it's something they heard. And so you're kind of saying, okay, that's important, and we do need to consider that and look into that, because I think what's hard is oftentimes Christians are portrayed very negatively, and rightly so, in the media. I don't align with a lot of what I see in what is portrayed as Christian in the media. Yeah. And so for kids to grow up in a culture that way, it's just really hard for them. So I feel like your book is so perfect to be able to give the teenagers the new book to read themselves, and to kind of, to respect them enough to say, you're smart. Let me just give you something to chew on here. And we're supposed to love God with all of our heart, all of our mind, all of our strength. And so I think sometimes right now there's a culture that says that, people aren't going to come to Jesus through their minds. But I find a lot of people do come through their minds. And I see even Jesus appealing to people, especially the Pharisees, with logic. And so I know in our house, we chew on things a lot. We're just that way. That's just how we're wired. And so for me to be able to give that to my son has been really a blessing to our conversations, and added a lot. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and the reason, so for those who aren't familiar, because it hasn't quite come out yet, though, I think you can already pre-order it. I've written a book called 10 Questions Every Teen Should Ask and Answer About Christianity, which is in some ways a junior version of Confronting Christianity. And I wrote it, kids, as probably we all know, develop at very different rates and sort of hit questions at very different times. My eldest child is 10 going on 11, and she'll be ready to read this book, even though it's sort of billed as a teen book.
Right.
there'll be some kids who maybe sort of 16 and this would be the best book for them. There's lots of Disney, lots of Harry Potter, engaging some really hard questions and trying to maintain the same sort of standard of channeling insight from experts that the adult book does, but at the same time making it more accessible for kids. So if folks are wanting to process some of these questions with their children or their grandchildren, my hope is that this book would be an easy one, for us to read as parents or grandparents, and also to pass on to our kids for them to read and explore as well. So trying to engage some of the same sorts of content.
So we were, talking with friends the other day, and we had a great conversation, but one of the questions that came up is, isn't Christianity causing violence? Isn't that? And so I thought, well, how perfect would it be to hear a little bit, I think the culture right now could hear a little more about why, I think you say, doesn't literature cause violence or something? So we have to be more specific. And so what would you say to somebody that says, doesn't Christianity cause violence?
Yeah, the way that it's often framed, at least in my experience, is people say, doesn't religion cause violence?
Yeah.
That's where I would say almost any statement we make about religion is kind of like a statement made about philosophy. I mean, if you said, doesn't philosophy cause violence? I'd have to say, well, which philosophy are we talking about? Because there are all sorts of different philosophies, actually. And so I think we need to look at Christianity in particular. And one of the things we'll notice when we do, especially if we put Christianity in its historical context, and the world in which sort of Christianity sprang up, we'll find that many of our moral standards have actually come to us from Christianity. So, for example, in the Greco-Roman world into which Christianity was born, the idea of going and kind of completely decimating your enemies was not problematic at all. It would be like, your sports team won, brilliant, great, everybody's happy, have a party. Jesus came along and said, love your enemies. It didn't make any sense at all. He told the famous story of the Good Samaritan. And it's really hard for us to actually hear that story well, because in our minds, if we've heard the word Samaritan at all, we've only heard of it because of Jesus' story of the Good Samaritan. So when I say Samaritan, you think good, right? In Jesus's specific cultural context, Samaritans were the hated racial and ethnic group. And Jesus told a story in which a Samaritan was the moral hero who, far from engaging in violence, went and picked up a Jewish man who'd been violently assaulted and left by the side of the street and took care of him. When the religious leaders of his own kind of ethnic and religious group had walked by on the other side and not cared at all. And we see Jesus intentionally going to the cross and submitting to violence against himself when he had the power to do completely the opposite. I love that moment when Jesus says, don't you think that I have the authority to call legions of angels right now? Mm-hmm. He's not on the cross because he's powerless to do anything else. He's on the cross because he is using his power not to do violence to others, but actually to take that violence and to stand in our place, paying for our sin in that moment. And then the whole Christian message is oriented around this man who refused to fight for himself, who told his followers not to either. I mean, even Peter, when Jesus is arrested and he tries to sort of draw his sword to defend Jesus, and Jesus says no, heals the man that Peter's hurt. And we see that this radical picture coming out of the New Testament of non-violence, even in the face of persecution. And I think one of the ways that we need to really get our heads around that better today in our particular cultural context, where my guess is most of us, most folks listening to this podcast, the question for us isn't on a daily basis, do we physically assault our enemies or not? It's probably less at that level.
Yeah.
We do, I think, have a strong urge to fight for our own rights, even at the expense of other people's. Mm-hmm. And we'll swallow all sorts of things in the name of fighting for our own rights. And I think we need to remember, I don't think there's a single verse in the Bible about fighting for your own rights. Mm-hmm. There's a lot about fighting for other people, like taking care of the poor and the vulnerable and sticking up for those who are oppressed. I can't think of a verse that tells me I should fight for my own rights. And I think sometimes we've kind of got things a little bit topsy-turvy in our thinking, even at the sort of more metaphorical level of fighting.
Yeah, the violence of words versus the violence of actions, for sure. And yeah, building up. Well, and I think that goes to, if we have these family members that are more interested in debating than actually just discussing, like, how do we not get into quarrels and about our religion and our faith, but actually just have loving conversations if we're not supposed to defend ourselves, but we are supposed to defend our faith? Like, how does the rubber meet the road there, and how do we walk that out?
And it's something that I'm obviously, faced with frequently myself, both in extended family and also in friend situations. I think it's really easy to convince ourselves that we're defending Jesus when in fact we're defending our own ego. And I'm frequently guilty of that. I have to sometimes sort of just stop myself and think, okay, am I trying to win the argument against this person and slap them down? Or am I trying to love this person as Jesus calls me to love my enemies? Now, to be clear, telling somebody the truth is loving, even if it's not a truth they don't want to hear. So I don't think that the scriptures call us to a sort of passivity that isn't trying to tell others about the exclusive and radical and offensive claims of Jesus. I think it is. But if you're anything like me, there'll be a strong temptation as we go along there to really try to defend ourselves and our own kind of pride in those situations as well. And I think that's where we need to strongly resist. What we need to remember, I think this is something we get from the scriptures, and it's also very much borne out in sort of psychological studies today. We think that we're primarily rational people, that we sort of logically come to conclusions, and that all of us probably think that we would be open to alternative rational arguments against our position. Actually, we're not. There's one of the leading social psychologists describes it. We're a little bit like a rider sitting on top of an elephant, and our rational self is the little person on top of this massive elephant that is trying to ride, and our emotional social self is the elephant. And so in order to persuade somebody actually to change their mind, we don't just need to speak to the rider on top of the elephant. We need to talk to the elephant. And the way that we talk to the elephant is by showing love and showing empathy and listening, and not sort of striking back with that one-line zinger or that sort of Facebook meme that we think is going to slap the other person down. It's actually by putting our first foot needs to be, okay, how can I love this person in this situation? Is it listening to them? Is it saying, yeah, that's a really important question? Is it saying, yeah, you're right, I probably have been a hypocrite? We're not here to defend ourselves. And I love how Paul puts it in his first letter to Timothy, where he says, this is a trustworthy saying, worthy of full acceptance, that Christ Jesus came to the world to save sinners, of whom I am the worst. I think often our non-Christian friends or family expect us to be saying, I'm a Christian, so I'm better than you.
Yeah.
Paul said, I'm a Christian, and I'm the worst sinner I know. And honestly, if we're brutally honest about our own inner lives, we probably should be saying similar things, and less keen to kind of defend our territory, and more willing to say, yeah, you're right, I probably am a hypocrite. And I'm not here to defend myself on that. But interestingly, Jesus seemed to side with those who weren't hypocrites, and to look for to welcome the repentant and the marginalized, and those who kind of knew that they didn't have it together, versus the people who were self-righteous. So if you're sick of self-righteous religious people, Jesus was as well. But maybe we can look at him together.
That's great. That's compelling. Much more compelling than a debate. So yeah, and I think that's where a lot of us find ourselves, is kind of just living in that post-Christian world and saying, okay, more and more, I just have to look inward. Like, where am I at with Jesus, and how do I just live that out and be that light where we are, instead of trying to come up against culture that's asking these questions. I mean, we need to know the answers for ourselves, but it's like, yeah, the latest Facebook post, it's not going to change hearts.
Yeah, and I think even as we think about the sort of quite post-Christian world that we live in, and that there are reasons people talk in those terms, it's absolutely true that in the US today, the proportion of people identifying as Christians is less than it was 10 or 20 or 30 years ago. I don't think that's as bad news as some people think it is. Right. And let me just explain for a minute why. I would much rather somebody who is not in fact a Christian realize that. Because if you think you're already a Christian, you're not really going to look at Jesus seriously. You're going to think, I've got that covered. And there's been a lot of, for better or for worse, there's been a lot of cultural Christianity for many generations in the US, and there have been absolutely faithful believers as well. But there's been a lot that's been, oh well, this is kind of what I grew up with. It was never challenged. It's frankly easier for me to be a Christian than to be anything else. And even as we look at things, I think it can feel, especially for folks who've seen multiple generations, it can feel like, gosh, there's like this sort of progressive moral slump that's been going on for the last 50, 100, 200 years, whichever frame you want to take. And if you look at some moral dimensions, that's true. And if you look at others, it isn't. I mean, if we think about the fact that only a couple of generations ago, we had systems in America where Black Americans were in no reasonable sense being treated as equal to white Americans. And actually, Black believers Black folk in America are the most likely to be Christians, especially Black women, interestingly. If we go back not long before then, we have Black people being enslaved in this country by men, often by people who saw themselves as Christians. And so I think, whereas if you look at sort of some things that the Bible talks about as sinful, there are ways in which you can say, our society has kind of progressed down. There are other ways in which, gosh, if we look back into a past world with sort of rose-tinted glasses, we need to pick up our Bibles and realize, no, this wasn't the morally good time that we need to hark back to. Actually, it was a morally terrible time in many ways, that the Bible absolutely calls us to repent of. So I want to say that in a hopeful way, actually, to say I don't think America is sort of going to hell in a handcart in some sort of new way. I think as ever, there have been faithful followers of Jesus, living sinful lives, but living lives, seeking to follow him. And there are people who identify as Christians who honestly probably aren't, as that's always been the case. And the fact that increasing numbers of people who may a generation ago would have identified as Christians, but truly wouldn't have been, and now not identifying as Christians, that's not in and of itself a bad thing. It may be that they're actually more open to truly hearing the gospel than before, when they kind of thought they already knew it.
Yeah, I think that's such a message of hope, because we've heard for decades, post-Christian era. And I love how you make the point that our Christianity, it's a global, we have to look at the whole globe. Where is Christianity rising? And the fact that this is not, it's a change in America, but it's not actually, it's just a reality check that maybe there wasn't that strong Christian true faith to begin with. It was cultural. And so when we look, though, over the whole world, we see it on the rise more than the fall. And so that's what we need to look at for that hope and that light.
I think it's particularly fascinating what's happening in China at the moment.
Right.
So in China, it is truly hard to be a Christian in China today. There's some degree of inconsistency, but there is meaningful government persecution of Christians in China, and that's not going away. And nonetheless, by 2025, experts think that there'll be more Christians in China than in America, and some experts think that by 2060, China could be a majority Christian country. And if you think about that, the magnitude of that in global terms is stunning. And you'll find often that folks who've immigrated to America from China or have come here to study often come in contact with Christians and end up becoming believers themselves, which is one wonderful piece of what's been happening in China, as well as many Chinese folk living in China faithfully ministering the gospel to others Interestingly as well, it's predominantly a movement of women, which has always been the case actually in the church. Since the very beginning, there have been more Christian women than men, and that seems to continue. So whereas in a lot of people's minds today, folks who wouldn't identify as Christians, especially kind of white secular liberal folk in my neighborhood here, a lot of them would think of themselves as being on the side of diversity and sort of pro women's rights. In fact, if you look at the global demographics of Christianity is the most diverse belief system in the world and the greatest movement for women in all of history.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we just did a study for our Bible study, Jesus and Women, and that is exactly what we came away from, is just this this concept that Jesus came in and he turned the culture on its head and revolutionized everything and how women were treated. The fact that Mary could sit at Jesus's feet, you had to apply to be a disciple of a rabbi, and her sitting at his feet she was a disciple, she was a follower. And so that's amazing to consider just how he treated women. For every parable, for a man, like being the subject of the parable, there's a one for women. So for every single one, there's a man version and a woman version teaching the same lesson. So he's clearly
it's especially interesting in Luke's gospel. If you read through Luke with your eyes open to this, Luke gives us often parallels men and women. So it starts off with Mary and Zechariah. Both of them get a visit from the angel Gabriel saying, great news, you're going to have a baby miraculously. And Zechariah sort of questions Gabriel. This is a wonderful line. Gabriel says, I am Gabriel, I stand before the Lord, like I'm an angel and you're not listening to me, what on earth? And so Zechariah is unable to speak until John is born. And conversely, Mary has her faith commended. We see that right through to the end when women are the first witnesses of the resurrection, just consistent across all the Gospels. And the men thought it was like foolish talk, an idle tale told to them by these women. Because in those days, women weren't taking that seriously. They weren't really respected as, witnesses or valid, like legal witnesses in a court. And Jesus, rebukes his disciples towards the end of Luke when he says how foolish you are and how slow of heart to believe what the scriptures have been saying. It's sort of fascinating reading through Luke in particular, and seeing how women are lifted up.
So it was so good to be with you, Rebecca, and I so appreciate your books, and I'm excited to hear how this has impacted the people in my life and how they've enjoyed it. And I just ask that God would bless you. So let me just pray. I'll pray that God would bless you as you...
Yeah.
Father, thank you so much for gifting Rebecca with the education that you've gifted her with and with the passion to apply what she's learned and to give it to us in these books. And just in her speaking, I just pray you bless her ministry, that you would shine your light through her, and that many would come to know you as their Lord and Savior through her work. In Jesus' name, amen. All right. Have a good day, Rebecca.
And you take care.
Okay. All right, everybody. Well, it has been so good to be with you today for the Gather podcast. And I appreciate you just kind of flexing with us as we do an interview for Zoom. And getting a chance to talk to Rebecca has been a joy for me because I've loved her book. If you like today, like and subscribe. We would love for you to comment below on other things you would like to hear on the Gather podcast. God bless. Take care.